When planning out your ideas for shooting, one consideration for your shot choice will be the camera angles that you choose. The obvious ones, like a high angle, straight angle, or low angle, are things that I don't really want to cover here, as they're a little self-explanatory. What I'll focus on instead is the more specific area of perspective, with a particular emphasis on what is known as deep framing and flat framing. And in this tutorial, I'd like to examine what they look like, how they work, and the implications that using each technique can have on how your scenes play out. First, let's examine what we mean by deep and flat framing by looking at some examples of both. Here is a shot of a typical office building that has been composed using flat framing techniques. This type of framing technique emphasises composition on the Y and X axis. It's essentially a 2D perspective of the world, and we don't get any sense of depth on the Z axis. However, if we look at this shot of the same building, which has been composed using deep framing techniques, the change in depth is startling. The width and height axis have now been sidelined in favour of a composition that emphasises depth on the Z axis. The depth of the Z axis draws our eyes into the distance and the depth of the frame, whereas the flat frame version of the building did not allow for this. Instead, it encouraged our eyes to look left and right and up and down, and it did not encourage our eyes to be drawn into depth, as there was no sense of a Z axis. When it comes to flat and deep framing, it's worth knowing some of the technical terms that can come into play. Flat framing, such as this for example, is known as a 0-point perspective in graphic design terms. Framing such as this, however, which has some Z-axis depth, would be classed as a 1-point perspective. The building facing us looks flat. However, the adjacent block coming off on the right adds 1 point of perspective. This interior shot would also be classed as a 1-point perspective. The end of the corridor looks flat. However, the wall adds 1 point of Z depth perspective to the shot. This exterior shot of a building would be classed as a 2-point perspective, as it has 2 Z-axis points of perspective running from each side of the apex of the building. Let's now put some of these perspective techniques into practice and see what effect they have on a character and the environment we find them in. We'll use a simple sequence of someone journeying to work on foot. In the flat-framed example, there's no sense of depth to the world. The audience can't fully judge how far away the hill in the background is, nor how steep the gravelled slope is in front of them. The character, who walks in an exact x-axis direction, helps to emphasise this sense of flatness, and his movements across the screen from left to right help to enforce the sense of a flattened out world. It's an interesting visual technique, and often is used by directors to create a sense of a slightly enclosed world in which the characters are existing. It feels slightly unreal to our eyes, and the simple reason for this is that it is a, essentially, 2D flat image. If we were at the location ourselves and looking at it with our own eyes, we would see the depth in the location, as our visual perception sees the world in 3D. It goes without saying that shooting in 3D aims to combat this. However, I've yet to see this done convincingly. The same journey again looks very different when using deep framing techniques. The sense of depth is now more noticeable to the audience. And indeed, the character's forward motion on the Z-axis encourages this sense of depth perception. As the audience gets a greater sense of depth to the frame, it naturally feels slightly more realistic to them, for the simple reason, as noted earlier, that we're used to seeing the world in 3 dimensions. Therefore, any composition that encourages this feeling will feel more realistic to us. It must be said though that these definitions are not an absolute, as there are many other factors that can come into play that determine how realistic a scene is or isn't, and perspective is only one of them. As ever, the choice of flat and deep framing comes down to knowing your material and understanding how you want your audience to see the world that you're presenting to them.